Good day everyone, so is Cookie Shinobu the best DPS in Genshin Impact? Has Hyperbloom sucked the fun out of the game? Do you really think it's fair that you need to build one unit with EM, they do lots of damage, whereas your other DPS units with those juicy crit rate and crit damage artifacts that you farmed for are still not doing enough? Well, that's what we'll talk about today, because these are certainly sentiments I've seen around on the internet. Now, you'll see here in the background that we're going to be performing a bit of an interesting experiment. So I obviously had to nerf some of my damage sources because my account is a bit different than yours, but basically what I want to showcase to you is just mostly what you can expect your Cookie Shinobu to do, and you'll also see that once I put back the artifacts, just how far Cookie actually falls behind in terms of DPS. I think there is this notion that your Hyperbloom unit is doing the bulk of the team's damage, but a lot of people neglect what your other units are doing, your other Dendro units, your other Hydro units, and I want to point this out with a bit of TC in today's video, because it really does matter how well you build. Farming crit rate and crit damage artifacts on your other DPS units is not as big as a waste as some people make it out. But let's formalize everything we've said so far. Here is the official KQM build on GC Sim, so this would be what you can expect or to benchmark your stats against. This team does about 76k damage per second, and as you'd expect, Cookie Shinobu does about 54% of the team's damage, mostly by doing like Hyperbloom damage, but you can see that Nahida, Xingshu, Yelon also contribute quite a bit to the team's DPS, and that is really the lesson in today's video. It's not like it's just that Dendro unit that does everything and they're just so amazing because it's got this high damage floor. No, this is pretty typical for damage profile. So what I mean by that is, if you go here onto GC Sim and you look at some of the other teams, and you look at a team with an equivalent at C0 damage profile like this Hu Tao team, you'll notice that, well, lo and behold, Hu Tao is doing the bulk of the damage. It's just that how that damage is being done differs from team to team. So you can see there in the damage over time graph, there certainly are like a couple of down periods, but also up periods where you get lots of damage. In contrast, the Hyperbloom team has a more consistent damage throughput, and this just shows you how teams differ. Some get their damage on quickly and in short bursts, others do it more like periodically, some do it more consistently. You can see here with the Navia team, there are definitely moments where Navia's cannon is hitting, and she's now doing pretty much 75% of the team's DPS. So the damage profile and what you're seeing with the Hyperbloom teams is not really that different from what we'd expect on equivalent teams or like other hyper carry teams. You can see here with Linny, he does like an incredible chunk of damage, and there's also like significant periods of uptimes and downtimes. What this really all comes down to is that whilst Hyperbloom teams are really strong, I don't think people are giving enough credit for the fact that once you've built your other units, they're also usable in other teams that will give you the same DPS, and depending on the content, may do similarly. I mean, if you look here at my Nilobloom team, you can see that surprisingly a character like Kokomi is now doing the bulk of the damage, and consistently so. You see, this is the thing that a lot of people don't understand about Genshin Impact. Every single team has a damage profile like I showed you earlier. Some are front loaded, back loaded, do damage consistently over time, and this has interesting implications for the different types of combat. So if you have a team that's got a high damage floor and that does damage consistently over time, then you could expect this team in a situation like in the Spiral Abyss to do well against a couple of AoE chambers. We can see this certainly with Nilobloom teams and the Hyperbloom teams, precisely because you're triggering so many like Dendro cores that you can use. But against single target enemies, you just have a limit of 2 Hyperblooms against this enemy, in which case no matter how many extra cores you trigger, or whether you're using 2 Hydros and a Hyperbloom team, whereas perhaps 2 Dendros might be more beneficial, or 2 Electros, you are still not going to get the damage ceiling that some other teams might provide you. And that is the whole point of today's video. Like, characters that scale with, let's say, crit rate or crit damage, that have access to vaporize and all of these things, will outperform at the investment ceiling your teams like your Hyperbloom teams that have a higher investment floor. But in no way does it take away from the teams in any way. In fact, it just shows you that for different types of enemies and content, we can build different teams and have fun in a variety of ways. My only big criticism is that Genshin itself is not giving us enough content to properly highlight a lot of these different teams. If you look at the current Fontaine event, it definitely incentivizes you to, in like one chamber, to trigger freeze reactions and another chamber trigger overload reactions. And it's that type of gameplay that I wish they would add like multiple floors into the Spiral Abyss, where one team, due to their archetype, will have like an advantage, and then you have a couple of generic chambers where they'll just rotate the monsters out. That would be like so good, but that's also just a separate discussion for another day. In any case, where Hyperbloom really becomes very powerful, and this is something that the proponents that think Hyperbloom is just a great kind of miss, is when you start taking the low damage ceiling floor that you get from Hyperbloom, and you start mixing it with a couple of like higher like DPS ceiling type of units. So if you put in an Alhaitham into an Hyperbloom with Cookie, then you suddenly have this nice mix of like on-field DPS. You've got Xingqiu or Yelan providing some off-field DPS, and then you can trigger Hyperbloom, and the damage profile, the blending of that team's like damage distribution just becomes so much more flexible and so much more fun to play. But in order for that team to be effective, you still need to build your Alhaitham, you still need to build your Yelan, your Xingqiu, and it still is meaningful to then use these units in other teams. In other words, it's not the Hyperbloom that gives you the strong like team, it's the fact that it gives you a strong floor, and from that foundation you can build up some truly monstrous DPS teams. And guess what, there's still content which will not favor those teams compared to some other teams. And I just needed to make this like painfully obvious and clear, because some people just think that Hyperbloom has ruined the game, whereas I think it has certainly given us a new way of thinking of damage profiles, time to kill, and just blending and putting together new strategies, as well as giving F2P players that just want to play the game casual in the overworld an option to deal with the content without causing them stress. So now that we don't have that stress, MiHoYo, please give us the endgame content. But certainly from my side, there is no limitation or fun aspect that's been taken away from Hyperbloom. I think that entire notion is just completely silly, and it's also the fact that people don't understand how certain units just contribute more to the team's DPS, in which case in Hyperbloom it's your Electro unit, be it Cookie or Right, and there's nothing really that unique about it. In any case, I've rambled on for far too long. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good day. Cheers.